¿Me podría decir su nombre?
Oh, mi nombre es Esther Medina.
¿Dónde vive, señora Esther?
Vivo aquí en el sur de Los Ángeles.
¿Cuál ha sido el impacto que usted está expuesta al humo de segunda mano?
Pues porque estamos todos malos de los bronquios. Mi esposo tiene asma y luego ahorita pues se me enfermó de que le dio un stroke. Y más por eso pues le hace mucho daño al humo.
¿Y usted está preocupada por la salud de ustedes?
Sí, claro que sí, porque es que estamos todos enfermos aquí en este edificio, todos estamos malos.
¿Y cómo le afecta el humo de segunda mano a la calidad de vida y de su salud?
No, pues ya ves que pues el humo de segunda mano pues es el que más le hace daño a uno, que es el que lo fuma. Y pues nos hace mucho daño por los que estamos malos de los bronquios y asmáticos.
¿Usted ha pensado dejar de vivir aquí para escapar del humo de segunda mano?
Pues sí hemos pensado mudarnos de aquí, pero el problema es que aquí pues pagamos poca renta. Que ya tenemos muchos años viviendo aquí en este edificio, pagamos poca renta y en otro lugar pues está muy caro.
¿Y usted ha tratado de hablar con el dueño o con las personas que fuman y les ha comentado del problema que ocasiona el humo de segunda mano?
Sí, he hablado con los muchachos ahí que no estén fumando ahí pues porque nos hace daño el humo. Y hablé con el dueño también y dijo que iba a poner un portón acá para que no pasaran allá atrás de la casa a fumar.
¿Usted apoya una póliza para que no se permita fumar en los edificios?
Oh, claro que sí, estoy de acuerdo con eso. Que pues que pase esa ley que no fumen así cerca de donde uno está enfermo.
Muchas gracias por su tiempo.
No, gracias a usted.
All right. So with that, we're going to be entering our next panel discussion. So I kind of want to frame this discussion in this way. If we were sort of close our eyes and imagine sort of a future where LA City went smoke-free multi-unit housing, these are the voices you would hear. These are the people who actually worked in their appropriate jurisdictions on trying to pass smoke-free multi-unit housing policies, and in many cases passing them successfully and then implement them on the ground. And so I really want us to look at these four folks as sort of the future of where we can go. So if you have any questions, if you guys are policymakers, staffers, or just community members or community organizations that want this kind of future, these are the sort of the minds that you want to pick and see sort of how and what that would look like. And so with that, I want to just introduce the four of our speakers on this panel today. So as a way of introduction, if you guys want to just pick up the mic, share us with your name, just sort of your organization or what city or what jurisdiction you come from, and share a little bit about sort of what kind of work you guys have done in smoke-free multi-unit housing.
Hi, my name is Ann Song, and I'm with the City of Berkeley Public Health Division. We're a local city health jurisdiction, one of three, similar to Pasadena and Long Beach. So it's great that we were able to implement a smoke-free multi-unit housing ordinance back in 2013 in our city. I oversee operations, tobacco prevention and lead prevention. And my involvement in the smoke-free multi-unit housing ordinance was to really bring together different stakeholders and partners to help draft an ordinance that met the needs and concerns of the community. And so I heard earlier today people had brought up rent control concerns, and so that was definitely something that we discussed in the development of the ordinance.
Oh, I see. That was good.
Thanks.
Just to remind us of your name, your organization, jurisdiction, and what work you guys have done in multi-unit housing.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Statise Wilmore, and I manage the tobacco control program at the Public Health Department for the city of Pasadena. I've been doing that for, it'll be 24 years next month.
Oh, wow.
I previously worked, thank you. I previously worked 5 years at the Watts Health Foundation under Audrey Smith. Some of you may know her. She was my boss. And so for nearly 30 years, I've been in tobacco control. I love what I do. It is a passion of mine because my father died prematurely at age 49 from cigarette smoking from a number 4 heart attack. So this is a labor of love for me. Multi-unit housing I really had to dive deep into my soul because it is a policy that is not just about tobacco control, it's about quality of life. And I knew it was an uphill battle, but I also knew people were suffering. And so you have to take the fear out of your heart and say that you're gonna go and save people's lives. That's what you do every day. That's why you're in this position. And it's just been marvelous for me. So for multi-unit housing, I think I've seen a little bit of everything, from adoption to implementation to enforcement. And we are successful in Pasadena because we have a very strong community-based, resident-based coalition that really has very high expectations for tobacco control. And so we're very fortunate to meet those expectations and one day hopefully do an end-game strategy. So we'll keep you posted on that.
Good afternoon. I'm Myra Demeter. I'm a transplanted New Yorker masquerading as a Southern California girl. I went blonde for 22 years. I currently live in Beverly Hills, and I've served my community for over 20 years, first as a PTA president and then as an elected official to the Board of Education, where I was president twice. I retired from the Board of Education, and subsequently my husband had a stroke. So my interest really changed from education, which is where I hold my PhD, to health and safety. I was fortunate to be appointed to the Health and Safety Commission, and I'm very proud to have worked collaboratively with some of the organizations that are here today to pass or to present to City Council our recommendations on 2 ordinances about smoking. We first extended the first smoking regulations beyond the initial 2008 regulations. Then we were asked to do multi-unit housing, and we made recommendations were accepted by City Council. I'm moving forward very shortly. It's been done and passed by my commission since February with prohibition on flavored tobacco products. So very proud of our work here and very proud to be a member of a team that has managed to put this together.
Good afternoon. My name is Jose Igurbide. I'm a 23-year prosecutor with the City Attorney's Office. I'm honored to be here in such great company. I'm also a transplant from Connecticut, but I have not gone blonde. I've worn many hats with the City Attorney's Office, but in 2006, I had the honor of working in Skid Row with a number of issues there, including diverting the chronically homeless away from jails and into supportive housing. That was the beginning of my alternative prosecution experience. And since then, my most recent project has been, since 2014, supervising the Neighborhood Justice Program. It's a program in our office that allows individuals that have been cited or arrested for a misdemeanor crime, and in lieu of going to court, they get a chance to go through a community panel process using restorative justice values. And for those of you who may or may not be familiar with that, it's about empowering the community to actually have an alternative to straight prosecution, where they get to have a conversation with the individual, discuss what happened, what are the root causes behind that activity, and what the harm is to the community, or in this case, perhaps the building and the victims. Or together they arrive at some solutions or obligations that the individual will complete. If they do so successfully, the case is never brought to court. If they fail, the case reverts back to the criminal branch. So this is what I do, and I'm here to explore some possible collaboration with our tobacco enforcement unit as a way to educate individuals that are breaking these laws.
Great, thank you. So just to begin this conversation, I want to talk about, I think, a connective tissue that goes across the board of the panelists here, and I think that issue is community engagement, and whether you're trying to pass a policy and educate the public, whether you're a city council member and trying to give them notice that a policy is being considered, or after passage, engaging the community in making sure they know a law exists that protects them from secondhand smoke. So in your line of work, what does community engagement look like to you? And it might sound like an obvious question though, but what functional role does community engagement work in your different line of work on multi-unit housing? So whoever wants to take the question, we could do popcorn style.
So community engagement was a really crucial component of making sure that we could pass an ordinance that, could actually go through city council and could be implemented in the community. So we had a lot of involvement through our Berkeley Tobacco Prevention Coalition, who were tenants themselves and who had really helped to push smoke-free multi-unit housing to the forefront, so that council was willing and interested, and there was a lot of teeth behind their efforts. That was one really engaged group. And then another group that we needed to work closely with was the rent board stabilization group. As you've heard, Berkeley has a strong rent stabilization component, and so there are a lot of concerns from the rent board around possible eviction for especially long-term, low-income residents, and that was a big work in progress working with them. And ultimately, it was really amazing. I got to learn from them, and we really worked together in collaboration. And I think the way we enforce the ordinance, I think it shows how much work we did together. Also, the outreach, we couldn't have outreach to all of the tenants without the rent board's help, and they have a lot of data that we had access to. And so there was a lot of conversations. A lot of them were very difficult conversations, heated conversations. And without working closely with those groups, we wouldn't be where we are today. So that was the beginning part, or not beginning of the end of the beginning part, actually. And then once we implemented the ordinance, that was a huge work as well. And community engagement looked like presentations to groups of 1 to 5 to 20 to 30 people, landlords, tenants, and most of the people who showed up to those presentations were smokers themselves. And so it was terrifying, and it was also a wonderful opportunity for us to hear directly what their concerns were and to listen, be compassionate and understanding, acknowledge what their concerns were, and have a dialogue. And so I heard earlier today the importance of cessation. So we absolutely wanted to include that, the importance of providing resources, not just having an ordinance that said, no smoking, good luck, but acknowledging that it's a big, hard battle. And so what resources do we have for those who wish to smoke and are unable to? So we decided to actually devote some of our grant funding to providing free smoking cessation classes, and so we continue to do that today.
For Pasadena, community engagement for us goes beyond our 2 community coalitions. We do have a very strong Pasadena Tobacco Prevention Coalition, but we also work with our youth, the Pasadena Cigarette Stompers, that have been around nearly 20 years, and our adult coalition has been around nearly longer than I have. So community engagement really means local residents who have been affected by this. So at the time that this became an issue in 2007, we were having people actually bring in their elderly parents, where you could smell the cigarette smoke on their coats and jackets. We had pregnant women coming into our office saying, I don't want to have a baby that has birth defects. Can you get rid of this plume of smoke in my house? So for us, it was the complainants. It was the people who were being affected. It was the people who were letting us know about this problem in their home. They became the advocates. They were the ones who then turned around, emailed their city council members expressing their concern. as staff, we can't lobby. We can't, say, oh, pass this ordinance. We're only directed to do what we're directed by the city council. So when we had this groundswell of local residents really complaining, and by the time we prepared the staff report as directed by council, it was nearly 80 people. And that's a lot of complaints. So for us, community engagement really means involving the people that are affected by your topic, but it also involves your opponents. I don't play poker, I don't know how to play poker, but I don't like to put all my cards out there because I don't know what the opposition is feeling or saying or doing. But I do need to have a conversation with people of different mindset. They might have a concern that staff maybe hasn't even thought of, or the coalition members. And that's okay too, because your opposition is also a part of your community. And you do need to really have a strategic conversation with them about what are your concerns? How is it that we can come to common ground? And there's a way to do that where because you don't know what the council or county board or city council is going to adopt. So you can't say that, oh, well, that's not going to work or that's not going to fly. So there is a really great way to involve your opposition and actually makes your policy better.
I came with my cheat sheet here because we worked on multi-unit housing for over a year before we brought it to city council. And as you can see, not only is it filled with many, many different binder locators, but my yellow tags here indicated things that I thought were important to this group, but I'm going to summarize very briefly. We believe in engaging and educating. I think it's very important to find out what people, as T said, what people are concerned about, as well as to give out information about the process. So in Beverly Hills, we had a thrust to outreach and to educate. We had a website that we created to share the progression of our policy. We also have a community television, and so anything that went on, whether it was a community meeting, a commission meeting, city council meeting, anything that involved multi-unit housing was videotaped and put up on our television station for our residents. And we actually have people who watch these meetings. I was amazed when I served on the Board of Ed and people would call after watching them at midnight. We sent postcard mailers to increase awareness. We advertised in the local papers. We went on Facebook. We went on Twitter. We sent postcard mailers to multi-unit housing landlords and tenants to publicize the community meetings. We called them HOAs to say, come, talk to us, let us know your concerns. The process is ongoing. We need your input. Once we had this ball rolling, and we had 2 community meetings, day and night, and we had 10 commission meetings where we had public hearings, we were able to develop a list of concerns that we needed to address in our ordinance, which we then translated into a model ordinance that we began to work on and craft. We also provided a lot of information to HOAs and landlords and people in the form of sample letters, sample notification letters, sample leases. We had handouts at every city event that you can imagine, press releases. And so I think that also, again, what my colleagues have said here is we felt we had to address it from the very beginning. We couldn't just address the issue of people smoking and we're going to say you can't smoke, but we said now we have to do smoking cessation programs. So there was a two-thonged or pronged approach. Come on, people. I really believe in this, and we were able to inform and educate. We did have some people come forward who gave us some feedback that were negative. Most everybody was positive, but I have to tell you, in Beverly Hills, economics is very big. And so the biggest detractors from this policy were the big hotel owners who had condos within their hotel units. They wanted special treatment. because they felt that their foreign clientele had cultural norms that would be affected by our policy. It took a lot of convincing and some mention of cultural norms that happen in other countries that we wouldn't accept here. I don't know if anybody was present at any of those meetings where we talked about girls getting married at 13 and all sorts of other things that are cultural norms, but not here. But we eventually decided, even though we had a lot of positive, we had some critical input, that we would have no exceptions. So we did move aside the hotels. Standalone hotels were not included, but if condos were attached to hotels, everything was included in our multi-unit housing ordinances.
John, so to me, community empowerment is all about removing the traditional actors in the criminal justice system and leaving behind or leaving there in place the parties most important to whatever the conflict is, which is the community members, the victim, and the offender. In this case, it's a structured dialogue that takes into account empathy, compassion, and you try to meet in the middle. The process, the restorative justice process that we use to resolve these conflicts includes not just accountability for violating an ordinance or violating the law, as is often the case in many of our participants' cases, but also how to move forward in a more positive way. And looking at engagement, smoke and cessation, mindfulness as a way to cease smoking, and really linking up the individual, the participant, with some resources that will help that individual and in turn help the community.
Great, thank you. So, when I actually go out and talk to folks about this policy, even people who support smoke-free multi-unit housing, they're all for it, they're all gung-ho, but the question that I always get is, how are you going to enforce that? How are you going to enforce stopping someone from smoking in their own private home? And when they're done with the cigarette, how are you going to prove it? And so folks in here who might wonder, and might not read the ordinances to the T about how that happens. So for the jurisdictions here that have passed this policy, if you don't mind running through briefly, what does that enforcement look like?
Well, it depends. What does enforcement look like for multi-unit housing? I think you have to kind of take a step back and look at all the other kind of tobacco control policies that we've adopted over the years, smoke-free parks, smoke-free outdoor dining. This is a very different gorilla. It's a very different kind of policy. So signage is not just gonna work. Public education by itself is not going to work. You need to have a comprehensive campaign for enforcement, and your public notification and education to the public, the better that's done, the easier your enforcement will be on the back end. So I think the question is, how do you get people to quit smoking inside their own home? It's a privacy issue, all this other great stuff. But I think you, again, have to look at this as a quality of life issue. So if you want to smoke in your own home and it doesn't bother anybody, then that's okie dokie great. If you want to, expose cancer-causing clouds to yourself, that's okie dokie. But if it starts to drift and it bothers your neighbor who has asthma, or your neighbor who maybe doesn't have any chronic health conditions, but they just want to breathe clean air. If it's bothering your neighbor, then they also have the right to breathe clean air. So I think when we're talking about enforcement, it really is a much larger issue than no smoking signage and public education. This is really about the ability to breathe clean air. If you're working all day long, you don't want to come home to a plume of smoke. When we got some of the complaints, we went into, of course, by permission, some of the people's homes, and they were like, look at my living room. I can't even walk past my front door, and it's a plume of cancer clouds everywhere. and people not even being able to sleep at night, having nausea, headaches on their way to work, and then they have to push through their very challenging jobs. One person just bought a condo for $650,000, and this is back in 2008, and they said, I just spent a lot of money to inhale cancer. Like, what are you doing about it? So there are ways to enforce this, but I think we need to look at this as this is really no smoking in your home is really a condition of housing, right? Why is it that you can't loiter or solicit or urinate or do other things inside of places where people live? Well, it's because it's a condition of housing. How come breathing clean air cannot be a condition of housing? So I think it's the way that you look at it, and I think later on in my presentation I'm going to talk about tools and things that you can do, but it's really about public education and convincing your community that this is a public health issue, and it's really about our right to also breathe clean air. So it's not about accommodation of smoking. And the two things you want to stay away from as you promote this message is, exemptions, because they can get really tricky, and then also grandfathering people in. So I call it the GE, but it has nothing to do with, corporations or anything. But, you just have to really be careful, because if you start grandfathering people in, how is that different from the policy that you're going to adopt? So you're going to go through all this work and all this effort to protect people to only in the end have the same problem that you had in the beginning before the policy started. So just food for thought.
When we sent out surveys to residents to ask them what they wanted to see in our multi-unit housing ordinance, one of the things that came back was that residents did not want to be the ones to enforce this policy. They wanted the city to enforce it. They wanted anonymous reporting. So in Beverly Hills, we've had our policy ordinance in place since January 1st. We've had 32 code enforcement cases logged. None have gone to the last stage, which is a fine. But our policy, in which we looked to successful other cities, was based on them as well as on our dog barking policy, which is what the code enforcement people came and told us about when we asked about enforcement, whereby it is reported anonymously either by website, by call, or by text. The city attempts to resolve the alleged violating party, sends a notice. Notice doesn't work. The city attempts to call the individual, and the issue is only if the violation is observed can they write a citation. So there are issues with enforcement. Nothing so far has gone there, and we feel that front-loading with education really has done a good job of preventing us from having a heavy load in that enforcement area. But some of the other issues just is that you had to witness the violation. If they don't do that, they attempt to identify patterns. And if there's a pattern there, maybe they can send somebody out at a particular time, schedule site inspections, etc. But I think enforcement is a very, very important part, but it is a challenge.
Just very quickly, I'm not here to talk about policy until one exists, but back in 2001, from 2001 to 2006, I supervised the neighborhood prosecutor program, and we focused on problem people and problem locations. I agree that a graduated approach to enforcement is smart. Whenever you can, voluntary compliance is preferable because it's actually going to lead to lasting change. A graduated approach that resolves the majority of the cases through voluntary compliance, and then with some enforcement action on the tail end for those who are unwilling or unable to conform is preferable. Back then we had a program, the Citywide Nuisance Abatement Program, that handled most of the complaints and resolved most of the cases through a series of hearings. And most of those cases were resolved successfully, but there's always cases that have to be filed on, and proceed to trial or through the criminal process.
So in Berkeley, our ordinance is 100% smoking. Smoking is prohibited in 100% of all multi-unit housing with 2 or more units, and that includes common areas. Some of the concern partners, as I mentioned, were the rent board stabilization, as well as I didn't mention our medical cannabis commission. So the way that we wrote the ordinance reflects their voices as well. So there is a carve out for medical cannabis that ended up being confusing in terms of enforcement. But that's one carve out we included in order to meet the concerns of that commission. And so the enforcement is a little bit complicated because of the concerns regarding possible eviction. So what the process looks like is a complaint is filed. It's not anonymous because complaints can only be filed by tenants or owner tenants, people who actually live in the building. And then for buildings with 3 or more units, the complaints need to be filed by more than 1 unit. So the first complaint triggers a notice. We do an educational notice to anyone who has been accused of smoking in their unit or in the building. And that notice includes a summary of the ordinance, includes resources around smoking cessation. It also includes impacts of secondhand smoke exposure. And then a second and third complaint filed within 6 months, because we did want to have a time frame, could possibly lead to a citation. So in the past 4 years, we've received 214 complaints, and we sent out 78 warning letters, which means that a lot of those complaints are from the same, what we call responsible person who's been accused of smoking. We've issued 16 citations, and then only 1 appeal. So we did definitely want to make sure that there was an appeal process. There was concerns around maybe people taking advantage of this citation process or complaint process rather to retaliate against their neighbors for some reason not related to smoking at all. So that was why we also built in that all of the complaints couldn't come from the same unit unless, of course, it were a duplex. So if it's a duplex, there's only 1 other neighbor that's involved. And I have to say that it's complicated, and it still remains administratively a little bit of a burden. And so code enforcement is the office that actually enforces that. We as a public health division have no enforcement power. But because it is a little complicated, we took the burden of carrying that administrative piece. And that's actually been the most complicated part of this whole ordinance, is just keeping track of everything and communicating with our code enforcement. But they've been incredibly helpful, and they worked with us in creating the implementation plan to make sure that it was realistic and that we had a process that was fair and clear and open. Another piece, and this is the biggest piece that takes out the threat of eviction, is that the owners are not involved in this process. So it's just that unless the owners are tenants as well. So the only way that the owners are involved is if they have their own no smoking lease provision, which was a part of our ordinance, that all new tenants, there must be a no smoking lease addendum. And then for existing tenants, it was voluntary by the tenant. But by taking the owner out, they couldn't say like, oh, there's this new smoke-free multi-unit housing ordinance, and you're in violation of this law, and so we're going to evict you. So we really wanted to make sure that couldn't possibly be misused by some landlords, as there was that fear that it could happen.
All right, so the devil is in the details. So we're running up to the end of this panel discussion, but I want to give an opportunity for some questions. I know this is specifically when it comes to implementation, folks might have some questions. So are there any brief questions we can provide, or answers we can provide?
For Berkeley, given the carve-out for medical cannabis, do you get complaints regarding threatening health? If smoking medical cannabis helps one person but hurts people, how do you justify it if with a carve-out?
The question
Yeah.
is, how do you justify, I guess, Berkeley's carve-out of cannabis?
So that was really a big point of contention, and our concern at the time was that the ordinance would not get passed because City Council was very adamant. Like, we need to make sure that there are provisions for medical marijuana. And so it was a compromise. You know, we felt that as a whole, the ordinance would benefit so many people, and yes, medical marijuana can negatively impact those around them. What we also did was work with the Medical Cannabis Commission around education, around, you know, people have mentioned it before, other ways to utilize medical marijuana other than smoking, but, you know, acknowledging your question and concern, and it was a compromise that we made to have this ordinance passed.
One more quick
You
question.
have one more? In your efforts to implement and enforce your smoke-free multi-unit housing ordinance, did you have any direct or indirect from groups interference from the tobacco industry? If so, what did the interference look like, and how did you respond?
Or I guess in your line of work, did anyone run into big tobacco, and what did that look like?
I didn't run into big tobacco, but I did run into groups that had concerns about enforcement. I think with every really tough ordinance, you might have to come with some kind of concession. And for Pasadena, the landlords were very concerned about having to enforce the policy. And they're like, look, if this is going to become a city policy, the city needs to enforce it, which makes sense. But later on, we found out that we really need a little bit more cooperation from the landlords, because then they were able to say, once implementation was done and we were starting enforcement, some of the residents who really didn't want to comply really took it all the way, and so we really needed a little bit more cooperation from the landlords. We did also get some opposition from a couple of cigarette smokers, but really, when we did our front conversation up front with the opposing groups, that really kind of made the waters a little bit more calm. So I don't know of any known groups. There's some coalition members here in the audience, but I don't remember having any specific group come out that represented the industry.
All right. Marlene, can I squeeze one more in? All right, one more question.
Are there any resources within the city of LA that could be used for enforcement? Are there any resources within the city of LA that could be used for enforcement?
And if I could actually craft that, if the city of LA were to have a smoke-free multi-unit housing policy, who would be, I guess, and it's predictive, I understand, so we're not putting this into stone, but who would be the ones to enforce it? And what would that look like?
Well, that's really going to depend on how that policy is drafted or that ordinance is drafted. As I mentioned before, when we worked in nuisance abatement, we had an ordinance that allowed us to step into the shoes of a landlord and evict a nuisance tenant if the landlord was either unwilling or unable to do so. But in this case, you know, as I mentioned, in this case, I'm wearing the hat of an alternative prosecution program as a way to divert these cases from a criminal justice system that's already overburdened with cases and overly punitive with many of our cases. What I mean by that is You know, if you had a way to deal with this case or with these types of cases that is cheaper, that is more effective, and that leads to lasting change, then that's a good alternative. And our neighborhood justice program does that. Our recidivism rates for petty offenders that commit vandalism, graffiti, petty theft, we've had over 2,000 participants, 5% recidivism rate. Similar defendants that have gone, and these are the same type of impulse control type offenses. You know, these are sometimes good people that just make bad choices, young offenders. And when the same type of offender gets a case filed against them, becomes a defendant, goes through the criminal justice system, and gets burdened with a criminal conviction, their rate of reoffense is 5 times greater. So 5 times greater rate of reoffense and 3 to 5 times more expensive to prosecute them. When you put them through a community panel, you get to have that structured dialogue and talk about the differences between the victim, the offender, and the community members, and you get to arrive at an understanding or a solution that could be much better and longer lasting than if they go through the criminal justice system, where you have professional actors that really only know one way to deal with it, which is to punish the offender and label them a criminal.
I would just like to add to that for Pasadena, as we rolled out our ordinance and then we did the phase-in for smoke-free units, 100% smoke-free units, we started to see an increase in the number of complaints. And people were actually waiting until midnight on July 1st, 2013 to make that phone call. They're like, I've been waiting for this. Why didn't you guys make it smoke-free all in the beginning? So that's, you know, hindsight is always 20/20. But we decided, and I was able to convince our department director to hire a part-time temporary person that would just go out and just handle all the complaints. And that was really helpful, because it's the funny thing about enforcement. If you go strong for the first 1.5 to 2 years, the word gets out that the city is enforcing the ordinance. Social norm change is not going to happen overnight. People need to get used to the new policy or the new behavior. So you got to work with them. You got to give them a chance. But there are going to be people that are going to test the law. And so you need to have mechanisms in place to say, okay, we understand that you are smoking in your unit. You can typically smell it. It's bellowing out their front door. You know, have a conversation, and the person might say, oh, that wasn't me. I had a visitor come over the weekend, but they're gone now. But you know, we want to comply. Just tell us what to do. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of the tools of the trade that we used in Pasadena and continuing to use. But the most important thing is you have to think about the enforcement first before you really start thinking out the, you know, details of the provision of your policy, because that's going to dictate what kind of enforcement you're going to need, what kind of level of effort you're going to need. So I think all of those things, that's why I said in the beginning, it depends. But it's doable. You're going to love this policy. Oh my gosh, I have to put a plug in. This is the most and probably the biggest population health policy you're going to do ever in your life, because you're going to save people's lives and you're going to increase their air quality.
All right. With that, let's give a round of applause for our panelists. There's a wealth of knowledge up here, so if you're a community member, a policymaker, or a staffer that wants to do this in your own communities, these are the folks to talk to. So thank you. I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Marlene.